I'd like to start off this next unit with some introductory remarks about Egypt, but I'd like to start by contrasting Egypt to what we learned about ancient Mesopotamia. On the screen, you'll remember that we talked about the Sumerization of the ancient Near East. ANE, that's how historians abbreviate the ancient Near East. Again, that's what everybody else in the world calls the Middle East. All right. The green area on your map is roughly cultural Mesopotamia, Mesopotamian society in a cultural sense. Okay. We talked about how later civilizations and empires would develop and move in. It's a place, on the one hand, of constant change. Old people move in, old people move out, new people move in, old people move out, new empires rise, old empires die off, new ideas are constantly flooding in. So it's a time of constant change. The Sumerians don't last very long before they're defeated by the Akkadians. The Akkadians don't last very long before they're defeated by the Old Babylonians. The Old Babylonians don't last very long until they're defeated by the Assyrians. The Assyrians don't last very long until they're defeated by the New Babylonians. New Babylonians don't last very long before they're defeated by the Persians. So on the one hand, you have this constant change going on. It's a place of almost constant turmoil. If you think about it, it's a place of almost constant turmoil today. It's just one of those worlds where there's constant upheaval and turmoil. It always pretty much has been. Let's hope for more peaceful times in the future. But at the same time, you've got a sense of consistency and stability because of that Sumerization process. Okay, the Akkadians invade, they take over Sumer, but they, for example, adopt Sumerian cuneiform. Okay. So you have Akkadian ideas moving in, but they're being expressed in Sumerian cuneiform. The Old Babylonians conquer the Akkadians. They have their own ideas, but they express those ideas in Sumerian cuneiform. The Assyrians move in, and they bring their own gods, okay, but they express their ideas about the gods in Sumerian cuneiform. All right. So on the one hand, it's a place of almost constant change with this very narrow cultural thread of consistency and stability. That's what we talked about when we talked about Mesopotamia. Let me see if I can get my pointers working. Yeah, I'm going to try to use the pointers again. Mesopotamia, again, is up here. Here you have the Tigris River. If you kind of tilt your head like that, at the top of the top river, and then the Euphrates River. You remember Sumer develops in this part of the world down here. Let me see if I can pull this off. Can I move myself around? I guess we'll see when I take a look at this video. Had to move myself out of the way of Egypt, but you already knew where Egypt is. It's in the northeast corner of the African continent. You already know the name of the big river here, the Nile River. On the map, Mesopotamia and Egypt are not all that far apart. But as you're going to see, their cultures are very different, and there's a significant reason for that. Because what we're going to be seeing is that Egypt is going to be a place of a very thick thread of cultural consistency, with only very small political changes. And we'll talk about why in a minute. But again, you know the name of the big river in Egypt, the Nile River. You may have even heard, let me move myself out of the way again. You may have even heard Egypt called the gift of the Nile. That's a phrase that comes from Herodotus, who's a Greek author, Greek historian. He's writing at about the, I could have looked this up, 4th century Herodotus, 4th century, 5th or 4th century ancient Greece. The Greeks were almost obsessed with the story of the Egyptians. The Greeks themselves are very different from the Mesopotamians. They're very different from the Egyptians. They have some contact, though, with some trade with the Egyptians, and they just become fascinated with the Egyptian people. As you'll see as we go through, an awful lot of the words we use to describe the Egyptians are actually Greek words, because we don't know what the Hebrew word or the Egyptian words were, and we had to rely on the Greeks who are telling the story of the Egyptians. But the gift of the Nile is a very famous phrase that Herodotus assigns to Egypt, and it's more than just a gift, I suppose, because the Nile River dictates culture in Egypt. Everything revolves around the Nile River. For one thing, Egypt is a very skinny civilization. It's about the skinniest civilization in the ancient world I can think of. The green lines on the map here are actually exaggerations of how far off the the river that civilization could be found. Basically 5 miles away from the Nile River. You draw a line 5 miles on each side of the Nile River, and that's the size of the populated areas, at least, of ancient Egypt. That's the civilized areas, the places where the cities are found. Everything lies within that very narrow boundary. Even pointer problems again. There we go. Well, let's go to the next one. Even this map is a map of modern Egypt, and as you can see, the populated areas of even the modern state of Egypt have not moved very far away from the Nile River. That's pretty much it. The Nile River flows from the south to the north. That's an unusual thing for a river to do. There are only a handful of rivers that flow from the south to the north. We happen to live close to one. That's the St. John's River, which flows north from, not too far from the Ocala campus, actually, up to where Jacksonville is, of course. And so that leads to some students to some confusion, because Egypt is historically divided into 2 parts, and that break comes about there. The bottom part is called Upper Egypt, because it's higher up in elevation, because that's where the water is flowing down from, you see. And so don't be confused when we talk about Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt up here. Lower Egypt is the very flat land down here, which is sometimes called the Nile, well, oftentimes called the Nile Delta. That's D-E-L-T-A. Delta in conversations about rivers refers to the area where the river flows out into the ocean and oftentimes creates kind of a marshy, swampy area. You may be familiar with the Mississippi Delta, the Mekong River Delta in Vietnam you may have heard of. There are several of these famous deltas around the world. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, Egypt is a very consistent civilization. Okay, it doesn't change very much over time. It's a place of almost constant consistency, rather than constant turmoil and constant upheaval and new ideas coming in and old ideas dying out. If Sumer has, or if the ancient Near East has a very narrow cultural consistency, Egypt has a very broad cultural consistency. The political changes in Mesopotamia are huge. Okay, the political changes in Egypt, they're very small. It's a very different kind of place. And the reason for that is essentially geography. Geography plays a major role in shaping Egyptian culture, not only in limiting its population to within a handful of miles of the Nile River, but because for the first 100 generations, 150 generations of Egyptian civilization, it's pretty isolated. I'm not saying it's entirely isolated, okay, but it's pretty isolated. I've already referred to the Greeks who are trading with the Egyptians, okay, but I mean there's nothing like the massive turmoil which is going on in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, it's very flat land. There's no natural or very few natural borders to keep people away. But to get to Egypt, and Egypt is over here, okay. Is my pointer working? There we go. There's the Nile River, which flows actually all the way down here to Lake Victoria. That's okay. I used to work, or rather I lived here. Well, I did work. It was volunteer work. Here in Homa Bay, Kenya, in southern Nyanza. And then I worked over here for a semester teaching in Kigali. So I know a little bit about East Africa. Anyway, to get to Egypt, you had to cross, you know what this is, the Sahara Desert. To get to Egypt from the east, you had to cross, of course, the Red Sea here, but also more desert. To get to Egypt from the south, Egyptian civilization is right about there. To get to Egypt from the south, you had to cross more desert. And to get to Egypt from the north, you have to cross the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea, of course, being a lot easier to cross than the deserts, but that is why Egypt is pretty isolated. Not entirely isolated, okay. But that means that very few people are going to travel to Egypt from other places. Yes, some will, okay. And that means that very few Egyptians are going to travel to other places. Yes, of course, some will. But for the first very long time, thousands of years of what we know about Egypt, it's a pretty isolated place. And that means that it's going to be very slow to develop new ideas and new ways of doing things. And I think I can demonstrate that to you visually. And that's what I'm going to be doing in the next presentation.